Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Information Security Summit 2020 virtual edition. This session is brought to you by ASMGi and Prevalent, and we're going to be talking today about third-party risk and where third-party risk comes in with the situations with the supply chains today. Our speakers today are Steve Racing from ASMGi and Brenda Ferraro from Prevalent. So without further delay, take it away, Steve.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. And thank you to the audience for sharing your time with us today and choosing our session. It's what a relevant topic. I tell you, we're in the midst of this pandemic and it's really affected the supply chain from a lot of different perspectives. So I'm really excited to talk about these kind of things. And, the reality is we get pretty geeked up every year around summit time anyway. And we have, sessions and it's really easy to get excited. And I just feel really good about being able to bring really relevant material to bear and speak with experts, true experts, and bring them to the table. So Brenda, this isn't our first rodeo together. We've presented together and had this conversation, but it's really a relevant topic, and we got a ton of material. So I'm really grateful to be able to co-present with you and have your expertise at the table. So thank you again for being here.
Same to you. You have a lot of expertise as well. We always have a good conversation. I appreciate having the opportunity to share.
Yeah. So I was thinking the other day about the first time that we met, and we actually did an event at a Cleveland Indians game, and it was at Progressive Field, and we had a suite, and you came into town and we co-presented together for the first time then. So I have a little pop quiz for you just to kind of get things rolling. Do you remember when that was?
Oh, goodness. It had to have been like around the 2018, 2017 timeframe, I think. Yeah,
that's a pretty good guess. So I have little concept of time, but I had to look it up, to be honest. September 14th of 2017, believe it or not. So that was, we've been doing this for a while together, and a lot of things have changed from a third-party risk standpoint, and certainly from a Prevalent platform standpoint as well. But that was a great event then as well. But so there's a part B to this question. Do you remember who the Indians played?
Oh my gosh, see, I go to events to talk, but I'm not really a sports fan. So those types of things don't really necessarily reside in my memory bank. All I remember is that the team that won, it was like extra innings or something happened where we had a really good time at the end of the game because there was such a team event going on. Right.
It definitely was an edge of your seat kind of game. It went 10 innings. It was the Kansas City Royals, by the way.
Okay.
So, and Cleveland won 3-2 in 10 innings. So it was a great outing from that perspective. But it's just kind of funny that we were, you pay to rent the facility and then it goes into extra innings. So we had a lot of time on our hands, that's for sure. So it was really cool, but that was a fun time. Yeah, that was a fun time, and it was in the fall. So, but it's great to be with you again. And I want to get things rolling because I know we do have a limited amount of time. So I just want to talk through the agenda real quick because it's such a relevant topic when we talk about the pandemic that's currently going on. And if it wasn't this, what would it be, and when would it be? And positioning yourself to be prepared, I think, for pretty much anything, right? So there are a lot of things that could affect the supply chain from this way. But today, just based on the pandemic that's going on, I mean, global companies, if you source globally, it's very, very challenging. But a lot of businesses, as consumers, like if you've ordered something online, delivery times are just kind of up in the air, right? Nobody really knows, and commitments. If you're manufacturing something, how do you get your raw materials that you need? There are so many implications. And then just the kind of expediting, a lot of companies have had to really move quickly to adopt new technologies and onboard new third parties, right? So how do you establish those risks? So I'm really excited to go through these things with you. So just from an agenda standpoint, accelerating procurement and sourcing, I mean, that's specifically something we're going to talk about. So that's really cool. Expanding the sources of vendor risk intelligence. So how do you do those things, right? So, and how do you bring in the data that you need to really evaluate your vendors appropriately and those kind of things. Working with your suppliers to proactively reduce the risk and ensure compliance. I think that's a huge area, and Prevalent does a great job as a platform in being able to do that, and just the expertise in general on how to bolt all those moving parts together to make it effective, driving more informed risk-based decision making across your organization. So that's a phenomenal way to really pull all the stuff together. And I say a lot of times to our customers and our prospects, our number one job is to give people the information they need to make good business decisions. And I think that's what we're really going to talk about today. So the other point I want to make is that this session is being recorded. We're recording ahead of time just to avoid any disruptions that are possible as it relates to third parties that we're relying on, certainly. But we're going to do, at the end of the presentation, we're going to do a live Q&A session. So everybody will have an opportunity to really interact with us and ask questions live, real time at the end of the session. So we want to make sure that we reserve some time for that. So I just wanted to highlight that. So let's get started. So I'm gonna kind of guide us through this process by asking you some questions, Brendan, tapping into that wisdom that you have from how to address these things. So just if you look at, if you look at these things, what are the challenges that you see with accelerating procurement and sourcing that goes on in a time of need like this?
Yeah, I'm finding that as I'm working with all the industries and helping them to mature their programs, that procurement and sourcing know a lot about who you're working with. Sometimes not as much as you need when you're trying to perform due diligence, but there are four main components that are really important for us to engage with that department from a third-party perspective. And not only procurement and sourcing, but also your risk and compliance and legal departments as well. But if we start from the beginning, knowing your universe, I am continuously finding out from companies that they're not able to get a holistic list from their procurement and sourcing organization. Now, that's mostly in the US. In the UK, it's flip-flopped. The UK is great in the procurement area. They're able to tell you who they work with, who's working with, who has the sponsorship or ownership. All the information is normally held and performed within the procurement and sourcing. Whereas in the US, there's multiple different hands, there's multiple different departments. So that universe is important in order to know what are you going to work on first, second, and third. Now, also the request for proposals and information, which I call the RFX, and selection is we need to help be an enabler for the procurement and sourcing by bringing them intelligence before they make their selection so that you reduce the heavy lift or know what the lift is going to be to help their security posture raise to what you expect it to be. Profiling and context. There's a lot of companies that are still doing due diligence based on unknown engagement factors. So you really have to look at why are you working with this particular third, fourth, fifth party, and what are they doing for you so that you're looking at the appropriate controls that you have to apply and also profiling them accurately. And then finally, what's really coming to play is that you can't really just use a checklist, an attestation, or an Excel document questionnaire. That is basically telling you what they want to let you know. You really have to look at the outside in, where it's basically a threat intelligence report or some type of a verification approach that says what they told you is effective and in force.
Right. And they don't always match, right? What you see from the outside in versus the inside out.
And that's good to have it as a balance, because if the intelligence is something different than what they've informed you in a response perspective, then you're able to normalize that and really look at, okay, well, they're saying that they're doing this control, but the outside in is saying something different. Let's kind of look at that a little bit tighter and closer.
Yep. Do you see any, like as it relates to the pandemic, the current situation, right? So a lot of enterprises have had to adopt technologies at a lightning pace, right? Because they found out that they don't have enough VPN capacity to handle everybody working remotely, or they want to do video conferences and these kind of things, right? They want to do a security summit remotely, right? So all of these things, they add up to adopting technologies, really quickly, and onboarding vendors that maybe you currently use, but maybe they're new, right? What do you think about that piece of the expediting onboarding when you have a business need that's really driving making this happen quickly, but you still have to evaluate risk?
So many of the guidance that I provide from an adversary perspective is I basically say, I'm advising you to look at what you can get your hands on as rapidly as possible,
Yep.
and then do the proper due diligence as you go along. So it doesn't, I'm not reflecting appropriately that you should do a contract without doing due diligence or the proper due diligence. I'm saying get what you can, make a decision, and then do the due diligence and shore up afterwards. The other thing that I'm also noticing is that a lot of third-party risk is an IT majority. It's expanding to the supply chain isn't just data handling, hosting, or processing. It's actually, like you said at the beginning of this webinar, manufacturing, transportation. The one big story that I like to use, and it's probably been overused, so I apologize if you've heard it before, but in the healthcare industry, this is relevant because of what we're going through with COVID. There is a vial that's created in one region that it's a single concentration risk, that if that vial is not able to produce, the medication or the drug that's transported with that vial cannot get to a patient or someone in need. And then that could be it could be cost life or death or whatever it could be. But that's the type of stuff that we're looking at. And then also, if you think about the toilet paper situation, we had a production issue and an uptick in demand and then delivery. And even today, since we're recording this, I really hope I don't get a delivery that's going to interrupt our recording, but it might happen. So those are the kind of things that people are starting to look at. It's not only who is my data handled by, but what other controls are important. That's OT, manufacturing, transportation, strategy, resilience. Resilience is becoming the new norm for supply chain and outsourcing.
Yep, excellent. Yeah, and I think, we've talked about it before. It's a business decision, right? At the end of the day, whether you move forward or not. And so you need to leverage the information that you have. Our job is to give people the information they need to make a good business decision, or at least the best business decision you can make at the time. So are you seeing an expansion in the sources of data? In addition to the need for the data, but how about the sources of the data? Are you seeing an expansion in that?
I definitely am. And before we get into digging into those different sources, there's a clear, definitive line about efficiencies and programs. And many of the industries and the companies that have programs are in the manual nature or the traditional nature, where they're just trying to automate their internal controls and leveraging those vendor risks. What I'm now seeing is that people are starting to really dive into networks and sharing of information, or a unified approach that takes all of the intelligence and information that you can get from multiple sources and harmonizing and normalizing that with integration that will really give you the intelligence-driven decisions, so that you're not only looking at who you use in your first perimeter, but it spans out to multiple perimeters. It follows the track of who's working with whom and for whom, so that if you do have to look at something that might fall apart, you can quickly digest that and identify how to mitigate it as fast as possible.
Yep. Yeah, I think, you could take, like this slide, you could call it a maturity model if you wanted to, right? So as you progress through and increase your efficiency, you're basically increasing your maturity and those kind of things. I wanted to kind of go back to something that you said about, a lot of enterprises are using spreadsheets and a manual method, right, to do vendor risk. And that, what I've kind of latched onto from a spreadsheet thing, I'm a pretty big advocate actually for leveraging spreadsheets as a starting point, because I think it forces you to think about like how to do, what steps are involved to get from point A to point B, right? So do this, do this, do this. And so but the problem or the challenge with spreadsheets is not scalable, right? So as soon as you start addressing the implications that come along with scale, whether it's sources of data or number of vendors or velocity, even, velocity or volume, then spreadsheets become very, very challenging, and manual processes become very, very challenging, right? So just, you know, the thing that really resonates with me is as the sources of data and the amount of data increases, it just becomes more and more important to leverage technology to do a lot of that processing and correlation for you.
Yeah, we're in a time.
That's what I get from this.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't mean to interrupt you. We're living in digital transformation, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. And if you aren't able to take all of the great information that you're obtaining by those spreadsheets and put them into a data lake that will give you the ability to slice and dice it the way you need to, that's where the constraint starts to happen. So reporting really gets impacted, and you can know about risk individually with your spreadsheets and maybe using pivot tables a little bit, but if you want in-depth knowledge of your risk appetite and your risk posture, then it's really going to be important to start moving away from the Excel spreadsheets, gathering the same content, but being able to marry that content with other sources.
Yeah. And I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but just being able to correlate events and view the relationships. There's so many moving parts and interdependencies when it comes to these things. Speed and scalability.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about on the previous slide about the networks. And so a couple of them that I'm very familiar with is the healthcare, the legal, and the exchange. And this is basically where those Excel spreadsheets that you used to use in the past have been automated in a platform portal where those items can then be collected and shared amongst those networks. So if I was in healthcare, all of the information would already be pre-gathered and pre-exposed to me with approvals, and then I would be able to do my risk right away. So we're trying to get away from that administrivia of collection of content. If you hit the button one more time, Steve, it starts to go into all of the different components of intelligence that should be part of your supply and or outsourcing chain management program. So you need to look at what kind of community information is required, private sources such as, this is new, credit reports, legal actions, financial information, and then using public sources such as data breach sites and trade publications, because you're not only now in a supply and an outsourced chain management program looking at data, you're looking at who are they working for and with, and are their finances in shape, and are they in a sanctioned area? So having all of these other components included in your collection of questionnaire, that's what's going to get you above and beyond the way that we used to do things before February of 2020.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think it's awesome. And it's a great visualization for how complex it can get very quickly, right? So both the volume and the velocity is increasing at an enormous pace. And so that when I think about sharing, you know, data and networks, I think about, like, it would be hard for me as in isolation to know everything about threat intelligence and threat hunting and just basically have a grasp for everything, you know, that's setting out to do harm to me, right? But when I'm part of a community that has a shared interest, then you start, particularly when you start to share data and leverage AI and machine learning, to your point earlier, that I think there's a phenomenal benefit to everyone involved. And then, you know, just shortening the life cycle, basically, of doing a vendor assessment. If the assessment's already done and they're part of a network, then why shouldn't everybody in the network benefit from that? So I think there's a huge amount of benefit to come along with these things.
Well, before we move on, the one thing
please.
Worried about is the noise of all the information, because that's what happens is they go, oh my gosh, I'm going to have all of this. I'm not going to know what to do with it. Does it apply?
That's right.
So make sure that when you're talking to companies about who you select, that they really inform you on, am I able to share inherent risk versus residual risk versus contextual risk? Because all three of those are different. So some companies might be profiling questionnaires, but they're not necessarily telling you what the residual risk and things that need to be mitigated for your organization. And then if you get threat intelligence, make sure that that threat intelligence can be customized for alerts so that it's important to you and what you're doing with the company. That's one trap trap that people get into when they're starting to look for help, is not really understanding the differences between those.
Yep, that's a great point. One size does not fit all, right? Everybody has their. It has to be tailored to your specific applicability. We call it applicability, right? So it has to fit. Yeah, that's a great point. So the next question for you, the techniques. What techniques have you seen that really work well to reduce risk and ensure compliance?
So there are a multitude of techniques. If you'll go to the next slide, that will start to give us a discussion topic of the 6 components that I have adopted in my framework and guidance and when I advise companies. You always want to look at the entity profiling and onboarding, or vendor profiling and onboarding, as the key contributor to start you on the right path. And then the assessment insights will give you the information from a trust factor of the due diligence that's required from asking that particular entity or vendor or supplier what they're doing for their controls. Now, continuous monitoring insights then can be married with that assessment insight by telling you the outside-in facing information, and then normalizing those two together to give you a landscape of how everything is connected, working for, needing, required. And then the automation, because you're marrying information together and you're having to communicate with your suppliers or your outsourcers, and you're asking them to navigate those risks, and you want to get reminders of when do you need to govern and check what the health is of the agreement and negotiation of what they're going to be fixing. And not only that, if something pops, kind of a red flag or an event or a breach or an acquisition or something to that effect, you're quickly alerted. And then from there, just having aggregated reports that's going to tell you what you need to know from a digital transformation and AI and machine learning perspective, so that you can make your business decisions based on real true risk.
Yep. I love this perspective for a couple of reasons. You know, one is you get a pretty real perspective of what's involved in really evaluating a vendor, and there's just so many things. But we've talked about this before. The whole situational aspect of it, you can't just look at something from one perspective. You have to look at it from a lot of different perspectives, and this gives you an opportunity to do that. And if you go into the Prevalent platform, you'll see. And I think on some of the detailed views, it's kind of hard to see on some of these screenshots, but when you pull up a vendor, you get to, you have tabs for all of these things. But the real magic happens when you can correlate all of it together and really understand, the impact that a vendor or their performance could have on your business, right? That's because that's what you're trying to do at the end of the day. And so I just think it's phenomenal. And we're going to just kind of go through the details of all of these, Brenda. And then you just tell me when you want to move on, but we'll spend as much time as we need to on any given area. But I want to pull up the details and let you elaborate a little bit on each of those.
Well, as you were mentioning, those little tiles were tiny to look at, but now this is a bigger view of each of them. So we'll go through and just tell a couple little things on each one. So when you're looking at entity profiling, you want to know by context, by compliance, and what type of profile you're needing to address for this particular vendor. Using network information, of course, that's a lot easier. But if you have proprietary questionnaires, it doesn't preclude you from being able to use the solution, because basically, if you decide to do a hybrid approach, you might want to use a shared assessment SIG, for example, and your proprietary supplementals. And there's different ways that you're able to approach that. But you want to make sure you're capturing risks and that your portal or your platform has the ability to go in and pre-configure those risks. Make sure that it's mapping to compliance, so that if I'm a legal department or if I'm a privacy department and I want to go look at the GDPR information, I can take what's been gathered and show it to me in a view that matters to me most, instead of looking at everything under the sun that you've gotten in your hands. And then context. Why are we working with this particular entity or outsourcer or supply organization? What are we doing with them so that I'm not looking at them for something that they don't provide? It's hard to ask them to fill out questionnaires and say, hey, this isn't something I do. We should
Right.
already know. So moving
Right.
on to the next one. And you feel free to make comments as well, Steve. So don't hold back.
By all means, yeah. Yeah, trust me, I will.
Now, the assessment insights and the continuous monitoring, which is on the next slide, we'll be talking about those interchangeably because you don't always have to start with a questionnaire. Sometimes you might want to start with threat intelligence to start saying, oh, here's priority-wise what we know from the outside. Let's go ahead and make those the first ones that we want to assess with proper due diligence.
Right.
And I find a lot of companies will take their 8,000 to 10,000 or more assessments and they will run it through continuous monitoring first, make sure that they're in appropriate buckets of high, medium, and low for a range. And then they'll say, okay, we're going to focus on the high ones right now, outside of the new ones that are coming in from procurement and sourcing. And then we're going to go ahead and do our due diligence appropriate that way. And if you write that up in your policy and adjust it as you mature, then you'll be safe from the auditors. Just make sure that you let them know in your policy and your procedural documents that this is the approach you're taking when you're first starting or when you're, just getting ready to go. Now, scheduling give you the ability and automated scheduling to send out what's appropriate by the engagement. So you'd have categories that would identify risks. And then inherent and residual risk comes from the profiling questionnaire, where residual comes after it's been applied to your risk posture requirements. So you may have configured the solution to say, these 15 risks are my key controls, and no matter what, these 15 items are must-haves. So we're going to dig deep on those. The other ones are important, but it's not going to bring my company to my knees based on this engagement. So that way you're looking at what's critical and important for that relationship. And then self-reporting is also important.
Is there anything specific, Brenda, in your opinion, like from an assessment standpoint? So this is my experience with third-party risk. Like historically, and again, I have no concept of time, so I don't know how many years ago this was, but the question was, do you do DR? Do you have a DR plan, right? And so the choices were yes or no. That was a different question that's being asked today, right? Today, well, then the question, the line of questioning evolved to, include, can you include your DR plan, right? So not only do you say that you have it, but show it to me, right? Do you actually have it? And today, it's more than that, right? It's evolved even further. It's now include me in the testing, or how often do you do testing, or those kind of things, and what's the results, and share the results, or do whatever. But are there things that people need to make sure that are included in an assessment package? So some people are doing custom sessions, some people are doing SIGs, but what is it that people you think should make sure is really included? And again, my perspective is generally from a technology vendor, but it applies really to all supply chain, right? Any third party, really, there are risks inherent in doing that. And, we see a big shift in the business transformation thing to moving to more technology, and certainly in COVID with work from home, that's happening. So it's real easy to, kind of drill down on the technology side of this, but it applies across the board, right?
Yeah, so there's a couple things with that. When you have questionnaires that are yes, no binary, and they don't ask additional questions, many of them do, but it's not only important to find out if it's yes, no, because if yes, how well? So it's all really about the effectiveness requirements of identifying if you do have this control in place, kudos for you. Now, what are your governing factors, or what do you do for your testing protocol to make sure that it's in compliance and it's being followed? And so that's really important when you gather content. The evidence is important as well. There's a lot of companies that won't share their evidence forthfully to the information area or cloud environment, but we're starting to see an uptick in virtual validations. So instead of having a clean room that you go to at the facility, you would have a clean room that you talk to subject matter experts. And then in the most mature state, there are companies that will hold an event for their critical vendors that want to do reviews of them or their customers. And they'll say, okay, for one day, we're going to show you everything that we do for our controls, everyone at the same time. And then you can walk away and let me know if you have questions. So that's another technique that's used as well.
Yep. Yep. The one thing that really resonated that you just said was effectiveness. And I think today it's really about, is it effective versus does it exist, right? It's effective versus existence. And that's true. Continuous monitoring. I'll lead off on this one because one of the places that I think is a great use case for continuous monitoring is when you have to onboard vendors quickly, and particularly when you're forced to do that. Just take a look at the continuous monitoring stuff and see if there's anything glaring, right?
Exactly. And so like we had mentioned before, it can be done before a questionnaire is sent out to prioritize or even to make somewhat of a decision. I don't always advocate that you use threat intelligence for a yes or a no to work with a company.
Right.
But it's
That's right. It's just information.
Gives you some insight. And we talked about the noise. So it is a lot of information. You do want to be able to put some thresholds around it. For example, I had probably about 5,000 vendors that I needed to assess. And so I basically decided that anything that was a certain range, whether it was like a 300 as an overall score or a D or an F, if it was using alpha characters, then those would have to go through due diligence rapidly, or they would have to correct those items. So the contextual mapping is important as well. Don't just use the threat intelligence holistically by itself. Make sure that it is mapping and correlating to the information that you're absorbing from the vendor or the outsource or the supply chain organization, so that you're not just taking it in two different parts. Like one may say yes, one may say no. How do those relate to each other? So it's good to have a platform that can do that as well.
Indeed. Indeed.
Oh, my favorite.
Normalizing risk. Oh, this is a great slide. I love it. Yeah.
So way back in the day when I started doing third-party risk management, I did not have the ability for, if an incident occurred, to tell my CISO or my executives what was going to happen. They would call me up.
Do you remember what year that was?
That was 2013.
All right. That's right.
When I started my endeavor on this really grandiose career field. So I was responsible for incident response for 2 years as well. And whenever there was a question of, was it caused by a third party, it was very difficult for me to figure out if, number one, it was, and if, number two, what departments internally were going to be impacted by that. So this is all about having visibility and normalizing the outward in and the inside out information from intelligence questionnaires to say, not only does this data go back and forth between this company and our department, or even down to a third or a fourth or a fifth party, but this is how it's going to daisy chain affect us. And is there something that we need to do in order to shift the work, or do we have a center, like a single point of failure that's going to make it so that we have to jump on our feet and create something for the people going to the moon that is going to have to come back home? So we want to make sure that we're looking at it from a holistic view, and this kind of pictorial view gives you the relationships. Not only that, some questionnaires are so large that some companies aren't looking at the associated risks between the responses in sections. So say, for example, you have a section that asks a question and you respond no, and then in another section, which is somewhat similar, you answer yes. You need that to be associated and normalized as well, so that you see the full picture, so that you can help them with, yeah, you probably meant to say yes there, or are you using it here, or should you?
Yep, that's right. And if a challenge is attributed to a third party, a lot of times it's very difficult to know what caused the problem, right? What caused the issue. And purely from a cybersecurity standpoint, like we think about controls, right? Which control enabled or allowed something bad to happen? You may or may not know that if it's a third party of yours, right? So being able to get to that level of granularity, but being internally being able to correlate and attribute your risks to get a better picture of what's going on is huge. There's no question.
Remind me of a event that I went through way back when, where the third party was the reason for a huge issue that was very detrimental to the company. And I had the pleasure of going on site with that third party to determine the root cause. And it was basically
Yep.
management on an application. That's
Yep.
how deep it can go. And if you don't know those things, then it is very hard to find the needle in the haystack of where the root cause needs to be
That's right.
more mature. Now, from a playbook automation, we talked about this a little bit, but there's triggers and risks that get modified and adjusted, and human events that happen. So the active rules that are in a platform that give you an alert that says, okay, number one, you need to review this because it's completed. You don't ever want to accept a risk that has
Right.
been mitigated, but you haven't verified that it's really done. You could have an event that they need to notify you on, so it triggers a process and a workflow. And then also being able to look at monitoring and events that maybe happen and you want to know about them right away, and then automating the effects throughout your portfolio so that it's not just one for one, it goes to everyone who could be impacted. So being more of an advocate for helping your vendor ecosystem,
Yep.
because they are an extension of you. So you don't want to put them out there and have them try to figure it out on their own. You want to tell everybody and share as fast as possible, kind of like a information sharing and collaboration center or a coalition. Yep. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective. I don't know anybody who wouldn't appreciate workflow automation, right? If there's anything you can do to make my job easier, thank you. That's all I have to say. End of story, right? So these kind of things, just throwing an alert when something, when I have to do something, just getting that kind of, intelligence is huge. But anytime you can automate a process, it's great, I think, and certainly a huge part of leveraging technology and a platform for doing third-party risk. That is a fact.
Now,
and bringing it all together, right? That's
yeah, dashboarding and reporting using machine learning and AI. We talked about this already. So you have to be able to see what's on your plate or what's happening or where you need to make adjustments in your program or things that the executives and the board need to know on what the risk is. So it's critical. I think we have probably about 10 minutes left before we get to QA. So we probably need to skedaddle off of this, but we could probably do a whole webinar about reporting.
We could do a whole webinar about this, but what I love about it is that you have an opportunity to pull information all together and see it in one place, and I think that's huge. So here's a great question, Brenda, and you can elaborate on this a little bit. But are there unconventional ways to drive more informed risk-based decisions across an organization?
Yeah, so there's conventional ways that we're all used to doing, and that doesn't mean that they're wrong or right, but there's some things that are happening based off of the fact that we've been experiencing COVID and the pandemic and ways of work that we didn't know were going to be at our exposure before. So thinking about unconventional ways could be, some mature companies are already doing this, but a lot of companies haven't gotten to that state yet. So we'll dig deep into, what does that mean? So if we go to the next slide, just visualizing. I always like to use ABCs. Unfortunately, this is ABCDE instead of just ABCs. But we've had a couple times where we've talked about normalize and harmonize the assessment information and the monitoring intelligence. When you normalize that, then you can analyze it, and it really brings true risk so that you can remediate. So those insights and the comprehensive profiles are critical. And I think we could probably go to the next slide if there's not more that you want to say about this, Steve.
Just one thing real quick, and I know we have to keep moving, but just even what's in the bubble, like being able to do an assessment and continuous monitoring at the same time, that's the inside out and the outside in. That alone is just huge, having that perspective. And so we talk a lot at ASMGi about validating what's being done. It goes to that effective versus existing, right? It's more important to understand if it's effective what you're doing than if it's there, right? So how, it's the how versus the what. And I think that's a critical piece for sure.
And what's interesting about what you say about that is there's so much that goes on in third-party risk management. As you can see with this slide alone, the stop the pain thing, everybody's almost figured that out. So they're getting to the point where they're using networks or they're using traditional assessments. But then moving into unified and integrated type programs is what we're really talking about today, because the supply chain and the outsource chain, if I had to pick two things out of this, the two that I would pick is, I would say, unified risk registers, ensuring efficiency and consistency, that also coupled with the inherent and residual risk tracking. So those two together then would feed into I would probably pick consolidate, quantify, and analyze the threat intelligence, but add the information and responses that you are getting from those vendors and customers that you're working with.
Yep. The thing, first of all, from a stop this pain pimp, I know a lot of people that's still experiencing a lot of pain. So, but it's true. You do. I'm sure you do. You feel it all the time, and people are always saying, "Hey, what about this? What about this? What about that?" Right? So, that blocking and tackling the fundamentals, it's a challenge still for a lot of folks, and getting over that hump. And I think that's one of the places that leveraging a platform, we'll talk more about, this kind of total solution perspective, but that's one of the things that can help get people over the hump. But what really jumps out at me on this page is making informed decisions, because at the end of the day, and I said this earlier in our presentation, our job is really to give people the information that they need to make a good business decision, and being able to pull data from multiple sources and correlate it and normalize it and then view it in an aggregated form is just huge. And I think it's impossible to do that in a conventional way, right? It's almost unconventional by definition.
Right. I'm also seeing companies, as you know, go towards what they call either a risk operation center or a resilience operation center. And the reason for that is because they're just handing off, I don't want to do the collection and the chasing of getting the information that I need to couple with the threat intelligence that's very easy to get my hands on. So if someone goes and does that work for me, I can move myself and my program away from an analyst and more into a risk management firm.
Yeah.
So that's mostly what Rock Services does. They also can give good reporting, and they also can do some, they can be an extension of your team as well. You don't just have to use them at the beginning of the program. They could be at the middle as well. So use the sources that do it every day for multiple different industries, and you'll find that you'll get a lot more done faster. Yep.
Yeah, we say the same thing. Operations this is a huge area for me, and I'm a big fan of operations, because what I see a lot of enterprises, this is where a lot of the things break down, right? So putting a program in place, I'll click to the next slide and just talk a little bit about this one team total solution thing. And we've had this discussion before, but it's so true that if any one of the pillars is missing, then there's going to be a challenge, right? And so you have to build a robust program. But a lot of enterprises do that really well. Even if their operations are manual in nature, their program is, in a lot of cases, solid, right? And the auditors, if you're banking and finance, the auditors are coming and saying, yeah, you got the program part down. But technology, if you use your program to drive a technology decision, you can get really creative on things like SLAs and SLOs, and make sure that you're doing things that actually protect the organization, right? So we look at the program as an opportunity to state strategic objectives of the organization. And these are the things that the board care about, right? But at the end of the day, so define what those should be based on who you are and what you do. And then pick a platform that can help you achieve that. But the operation piece, and it goes back to that rock model of yours, to me, operations is somebody has to show up tomorrow at work and actually do this, right? So you can say all kinds of really neat things in your program, but if you don't build an operating model to actually do those things every single day, tomorrow, the next day, and 2 years from now, it has to get done. It has to be done. So there are so many philosophical things that we could insert, into this, but never ask somebody to do something that you wouldn't do, or expect somebody to do something that you wouldn't do yourself, right? What if you can't, if you can't do it? So in any event, the operating model is so critically important. And I think it aligns really well with your, with the operations getting it done every day. So to me, what that says is somebody has to do these things that you define every single day. So the other thing that's interesting, and I'm going to toggle the slide, but I want to just point out the holistic nature. Holistic by definition means the whole, right? And so when you think about third-party risk, it's just like any solution. We do a lot of cyber solutions. It's the same story really every time. If you look at it holistically, you have to have these components in place. And you talk about this on this slide, which I love this slide because it's overwhelming, quite honestly, with the amount of information that's here. But it's real, right? This is what it's like to get these things done, and it is really a holistic picture of risk, right? If you miss one of these pieces, that could be the gotcha that you don't want to happen, right? So what do you think about, there's a lot of stuff on this slide. Maybe just pick something. What do you think is really jumps out at you or speaks to you, Brenda?
Well, the one thing that I really enjoyed about the product enhancements that Prevalent has put in place was the fact that not only do we have our own vendor threat monitoring, but we also integrate with other companies like BitSight, or we have APIs with ServiceNow and RSA Archer, which are GRC tools. So we know that companies are individual in what they want to use as a harmonizing event. So we try to orchestrate the intelligence in the best manner of which you can use it, whether you have a GRC or you don't, or if you want to send information from a finalized perspective into some type of an area, or you even have BitSight, for example, that you want to use that data, but you want to harmonize it with what you're getting from a questionnaire perspective. So I think intelligence at every corner is also important, as well as what are you collecting and how are you collecting it, and what communication across those sources is being actively produced for everyone that needs it.
Yep, excellent. Yeah, well said. And I think we want to reserve some time for questions, so I'm just going to fly through this. We had a slide included, and I don't think we'll spend any time on it, but this whole concept of being in a virtual world is very real today as well. And, I talk to a lot of people about doing assessments, and they're like, we're getting assessed, or we're doing assessments virtually today, where we used to go on site to collect evidence and do all those things. So people have had to restructure the way in which they accomplish things. But I think just being resilient is about finding new ways to do things, unconventional ways to do things, and certainly a good cue there. Is there anything you want to add on this slide? Or
I think you and I have a humongous webinar already on this, so they can go and look at your website and get more access to exactly what all of this is about. But I completely agree with you. Our new unconventional, there is no on-site visits right now for whatever foreseeable future. So we have to find a way to continue doing that due diligence from a validation perspective, and it has to be virtual. So there are some techniques that you can use and implement. Yep,
awesome. So I want to click to here, and I just want to highlight one thing that you just said, and you talked about some of the new features that Prevalent has rolled out, and I think we have some people attending this session that believe it or not, were at the Indians game, and certainly some companies that were there, however long ago, whenever that was, right, in September of 2017. But that said, I want to make sure everybody understands that Prevalent's really reinvented, your model and your platform, and I'm really excited about, where you're at and the ability to help organizations solve these challenges with third-party risk, whether they be correlating data or moving from a manual process and up that maturity ladder and efficiency and all those things. Volume and velocity, those are the two things that really jump out at me. And there's a lot of pressure on cyber in general, but third-party risk, there's a huge amount of pressure on today by virtue of the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic and people have a heightened awareness around third parties, right? So But I wanted to make that point, Brenda, and I really appreciate you doing this session together with me. And I want to make sure that we save some time for a live Q&A session. So it's not goodbye, it's goodbye for now, right? So we'll reconnect with people and be able to answer questions live.
It was an honor.
Thank you so much, Brenda.
Can't wait. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.